Hello and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And with me, Gareth Tennant.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And ladies and gentlemen, you find me today feeling really, really guilty. Gareth is abroad working and has just run out of at the end of a working day to come and talk to me and has not had a chance to eat and is quietly preparing some food for himself. And I feel very guilty for saying, I can hear you cutting up that tomato. I'd like to up front and in front of everyone apologize for that and say, please keep eating now that I'm keeping you from your dinner. I do apologize, Gareth.
Don't feel the need to apologise at all. I'm not going to eat. I'm going to record this and then have my dinner afterwards. It's fine.
Oh, you can't see the look of his puppy eyes. Okay, well, look, let's get into it. This week is another one of our influencers. And this is a really, I say this from all of the influencers, but I think this, for me, was kind of interesting to do the research. As you know, we do this every time, and I try and make out that it's a secret. And of course, it's not a secret. Today, we're going to be talking about Richard Branson. And Richard Branson is a very interesting English character. And what I realized as I did my research is I had entirely forgotten about Richard Branson, which is really, really interesting given his background. And we'll talk about what he did, how he did it. And we'll probably focus a little bit more on his leadership style as well, because he spent a bit of time talking about it. But it was really interesting where there was a period in my life where Richard Branson was everywhere on TV, in the newspapers. And now we perhaps don't think about Richard Branson. Gareth, what do you know of Richard Branson? And I can say this with a smile on my face because, of course, Gareth, you're much younger than me. And so therefore you probably don't have the same context as perhaps I do about Richard Branson. So what do you know about Richard Branson?
Yeah, possibly not. So I do remember a time where he was certainly in the headlines and the media a lot more than he is now. And I wonder whether that's just because he's kind of gone past that point of making sort of massive business decisions and he's kind of in semi-retirement, where other people, Elon Musk that we've covered before, and the tech bros from Silicon Valley are perhaps grabbing some of that media attention around rich businessmen. But I know he started with the record label, the record shop, Virgin. I know that he chose that name deliberately to be provocative because he recognised that attention is good. Any publicity is good publicity and all of that. And then obviously over the years branched out into many different areas. So from starting with a record label and perhaps, most, or at the other extreme end of that spectrum, having a space flight company. But, on the journey in between, there's been holidays, there's been Virgin Coke, I think there was a cola brand, and lots of things in between. So an entrepreneur goes in lots of different directions. Two things I do know about his style. One is he's famous for saying something about, I'm paraphrasing, you need to hire people that are cleverer than you so that you know where to turn. They've got all the answers. It's not about having all the answers as a leader. There's probably a better, more succinct quote there. And the other thing is he quite famously early on avoided paying tax and was a sort of advocate of the hustle kind of mentality of you've got to do what you've got to do to grow. So quite famously, quite early on, avoided paying tax where perhaps he should have done. That's about all I know.
Well, that was very good. It seems actually you probably know more about Richard Branson than I had imagined. Maybe you're a little bit older than I thought. Let's go back to the beginning. As I said, in the 80s and 90s, you couldn't avoid hearing about Richard Branson or seeing him on the television. As you've said, a serial entrepreneur, which I think is a misused term these days. But if ever there was a serial entrepreneur, it was absolutely Richard Branson. If you think about what he is known for and sort of his brand, and I think brand is a really important term with Richard Branson. He was an entrepreneur, an adventurer, and as you had pointed out, allegedly a convicted tax evader and tax exile. And I really enjoyed, as I was learning a bit more about him, and I went onto his LinkedIn page, he describes himself as tie-loathing adventurer and thrill seeker who believes in turning ideas into reality, otherwise known as Dr. Yes at Virgin, which I thought was quite good and actually quite neatly sums him up a little bit.
Yes, I think the one thing I'd forgotten was in the 90s, very famous for hot air ballooning.
Well, not just hot air ballooning. We'll come on to that in a second. He is a man very much who continues to live his life to the max. But let's go back to the beginning. Born 1950 in Blackheath, London, and he was the son of a barrister and a ballet dancer who was also an air hostess. And I love that mix. So just to be clear, we're going to talk in terms of this being a rags to riches story, but it's kind of not that rags to riches story. The fact that his mum was a ballet dancer and air hostess, you can see there's elements of his future in that. However,
barristers don't get paid too badly either.
They don't get paid too badly. And just in case you're wondering and thinking his barrister father, ballet dancer, air hostess mother was scraping the money together to support him, his paternal grandfather was Sir George Arthur Harwin Branson, a judge of the High Court Justice and Privy Councillor. He did just fine, thank you. Good public school upbringing. He was educated at Skatecliff School and then Stowe School until the age of 16. And interestingly, and he talks about this, and in fact, he ticks lots of the boxes of leadership that we talk about. He has dyslexia, and he did do well at school. And later in life, he was also then diagnosed with ADHD. And in terms of his sort of switching from one thing to another, you can see elements of that. Of course, there's always a quote, and there's always someone who finds a way of coming up with something that will be remembered later. And on his last day at school, his headmaster, Robert Drayson, told him he would end up either in prison or become a millionaire. And I think he's quite good at that. In terms of entrepreneurship, his mother was an entrepreneur, and one of her most successful ventures was building and selling wooden tissue boxes and waste paper bins, which I think is fantastic because that's the least likely thing you would think they would do. But of course, the really important point here is that his family, his mother and father, were of course incredibly supportive of his business career. So interesting, left school a little bit early. There is a background of money, although it's not clear he personally was given a huge amount of money, but definitely a sense of entrepreneurship in the family. So as you mentioned, we'll get to his first sort of major business deal, but I always love these sort of details. His first attempts at entrepreneurship, I think this was just sort of when he was 16, was to grow and sell Christmas trees and to sell budgerigars. That apparently did not work. So instead, he launched
those two natural bedfellows, Christmas trees and budgerigars.
But even then, you're gonna think back to me talking about Christmas trees and budgerigars, because this is a man who is an entrepreneur and he doesn't take no for an answer in a way. So this idea we go, that's ridiculous. That certainly would never stop him. And there was your first example. But he went on to launch a magazine named Student, and that was in 1966. Now, it wasn't as successful as he'd hoped, but he's very clever, and he realized the magazine could become a really important part of a different business, and that was a mail order record business. He used, obviously, the magazine to sell these records, and that became the more valuable part of the business.
Yeah. And that was Virgin Records, was it?
Well, hold on. That's not Virgin Records yet. No. But this is true for probably all of our influencers, which is you kind of think you know the story, but there's a little bit more below the surface. So he started that magazine with a chap named Powell, but he then later took over the student magazine after lying to Powell that the workers at the magazine opposed his plans to turn the magazine to a cooperative. So I think that's fascinating. I think what we're going to see later on is a man who it feels like he has values and does the right thing. Early in his life, he's already, I don't know whether this is too strong a word, probably not, lying to get ahead. And I think that's really interesting. And obviously, we'll come on to the tax conversation as well a little bit later.
That does sound like that's not a little white lie, is it? That is harming somebody else to get ahead.
That
That feels bad.
that feels bad, and also perhaps a little bit ruthless. Perhaps someone who's driven.
Yeah.
But we'll get there. And by the way, don't worry. Anyone who knows Richard Branson and likes Richard Branson, this is not going to be an hour of bashing Richard Branson. Most other things are very positive. Anyway, so he's using the magazine now to advertise popular albums. And as I said, he's driving record sales of those albums. And then he says, oh, I now want to sell those albums myself, and I'm going to do that at the expense of high street stores. So he started competing with places like WH Smith, which back in the 70s was huge. And so really interesting that he's starting to have ambitions where he's going to take on these, what were at the time Goliaths. And he once said, there's no point in starting your own business unless you do it out of a sense of frustration. So many of these things he does, he either outright says it's because he's frustrated or it's because he's passionate. There's a lot of passion driving these things. And at the time it was, I can sell records cheaper than I can buy them in the high street. And I'm pretty annoyed about that.
Yeah.
So
I can buy that argument. I wonder if you do need a sense of frustration, or whether you just, as you say, need to have the drive to push through, and therefore you need the passion. So, do you need frustration, or could you do it equally well with excitement about a new opportunity or
I
a new product?
I certainly think you can do it with both. I suspect it's a combination with Branson. And frustration, rather than it being a negative word, is I'm really frustrated. I want to go out and solve that problem. But anyway, so where we are now is he is starting a record business. He's not making records. He's not producing records. He's literally buying records from other people and selling them. And in fact, he opens a record shop in Oxford Street. At this point is when he has his problem with Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs Organisation, because it turns out the stock he was selling had actually been declared as export stock, and therefore it had not had tax paid on it. And so while the matter was not brought to court, Branson agreed to repay any unpaid purchase tax, which was 33%, and he had a £70,000 fine. And apparently it was so serious, that fine, that his parents had to remortgage the family home to help pay the settlement. Now, lots there. This is before sort of when we, as you said, you get to Virgin Records. There's an awful lot going on there in terms of taking risk, in terms of, as we said, lying, and in terms of being passionate about starting a business. This is a young man with an awful lot going on.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it, that we're starting to see absolutely risk taking, which I think everybody knows is kind of par for the course for being an entrepreneur and being successful. It's also par for the course for not being successful, and most businesses are unsuccessful. That ruthlessness and that willingness to bend the rules, break the rules, that's slightly different. And we don't see that a lot or maybe we do, with successful business people. I don't know.
What's interesting, so this period we're talking about, he's now 21, 22. I think this is him learning about taking risks. As you go through the rest of his career, There doesn't seem to be any of these issues around tax. He doesn't seem to be lying to people. I wonder whether this is him learning how to behave as an entrepreneur. But anyway, it's 1972. He's 22 and he's earned money from his record store. And as you alluded to earlier, Branson launches his record label, the now famous Virgin Records. The name Virgin was apparently suggested by one of his early employees because they were all new at business. None of them knew how to run businesses. You can imagine it was a small number of people going, we should start a record label, and they'd never done it before. You can tell his success or his ability to make things happens early. Apparently, it was around that time he bought a country estate to the north of Oxford in which he put a recording studio. This is called the Manor Studio. And at the time, he leased the studio to artists who were breaking through. And part of that was then Virgin Records. And so again, this is an age thing. See, I know this, you may or may not. Do you know who his first album as a release for Virgin Records was?
I have absolutely no idea, but I'm very intrigued.
There was this person that no one had heard of called Mike Oldfield, and he recorded this thing called Tubular Bells. And
I have heard of Mike Oldfield.
That was the first release for Virgin Records, which
oh, wow.
For people of my age, know that was a huge chart-topping bestseller. He went on very quickly to build a reputation in the industry and started to sign all sorts of interesting people. The Sex Pistols were one of his early signatories, and there's lots of stories, and I've read slightly different versions, but fundamentally, Virgin Records signed the Sex Pistols because other companies didn't want to sign the Sex Pistols because they were too difficult. Clearly, he knew who to sign and what to do. Here's some other people that signed with Virgin Records: the Rolling Stones, Peter Gabriel, XTC, Japan, UB40, Stevie Winwood, Paul Abdul. And all of a sudden, and quite quickly, this became the world's largest independent record label. So first, it's interesting. I was about to say his first proper business. Clearly, it's not his first proper business, because remember, we had the budgerigars, the Christmas trees, the magazine, the store selling records. But as it were, each one led to the next thing. So it's 1979 now. He's a little bit older. His net worth is £5 million. This is a very successful young man. So right now, clearly, he is going to double down in the record business and he's going to grow his record empire, right? Well, not quite. So we're going to talk about his airline. Arguably, technically, this is not how he started his airline. However, my question to you is, what was Richard Branson's first step in the airline business?
So he's selling records. He's just created a relatively successful recording studio.
I like where you're going. I like where you're going.
To sign up famous people.
I like it.
Is it private jets to fly people to recording studios?
I love where you're going. I love the effort you put in. You were kind of almost right and also totally wrong. So, Richard Branson and his future wife traveling to Puerto Rico, and their flight is cancelled. They are stranded on a small island airport with hundreds of other passengers. What do you do? Well, if you're Richard Branson, you pick up the telephone and you find a charter plane, you charter it, you go to the rest of the passengers, divide the cost of the plane by the number of seats, and you charge the other stranded passengers $39 to rebook their seats. That wasn't the start of Virgin Airways because he just chartered an aeroplane, but I think there is something quite magical in that story. When was the last time a plane was cancelled and you thought, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to charter an aeroplane and I'm going to then sell the seats back to everyone here.
Yeah, that's incredible for many reasons. But the idea is not that creative. but the balls that you must have to take that risk is massive, because in hindsight it sounds brilliant and simple, but in reality, of course, you're going to be there, you're going to have to commit an amount of money on the confidence that you're going to be able to convince all these people that this is going to work. And I just think for most normal people, that would be well beyond their risk tolerance to even consider it as an idea. But it's brilliant.
I mean, and I agree with you about the risk. We see this time and time and time again. But not only that, actually, and by the way, Clausewitz is watching over us and saying everything is simple, but simple things are hard. And this is a pretty good example of that. But actually, the more fundamental point here is how many people think out of the box like that and say, the flight has been cancelled. Most people will go to, I'll rebook on the next flight. How many people do you know say, or I could charter an aeroplane? So I think that's a fascinating story. And I think that just that little example shows how he is different and actually how quite clever he is as well. So we'll come back to the airline because that was a different story. But the next thing is a question. Because I'm going to try and do today as a sort of a set of questions. So Gareth, if you are going to buy a tropical island, how would you go about doing it?
Well, this is a challenge I come up with quite regularly when I'm scouring the world for my tropical island. Well, in the modern world, you jump on the internet, I suppose.
Yep.
And you do a lot of research, and you probably think about why you want an island, where that would be. You do a lot of reaching out to real
Island.
real estate experts in that kind of
islands are
high-end
us.
business. Yeah, islands are us. You get advice, you get legal advice.
Presumably, you'd have a pretty large bank account if you're buying a tropical island, presumably.
Well, I wouldn't even start the search until I got a pretty large bank account. Are you going to tell me that Richard Branson bought an island and got somebody else to pay for it?
Not quite, but you're starting to get the hang of these leading questions. So Richard Branson is quite famous for a place called Necker Island. That is his island. And he discovered that this island was for sale in 1978. And he was looking for islands, as it were, to house his record label. Imagining, he thought, what I really want is a tropical island where I can have a recording studio. So he found Necker Island in 1978. He was shown the island, and the asking price for the island was $6 million. So I could ask how much you think he's going to offer, but you know it's going to be a lowball number. He turns around and says, you've asked for $6 million. I'm going to give you $100,000 for this island. That's pretty. There's chutzpah, I believe the phrase is there. Not only did the owner reject the offer, he kicked him off the island and told him to go away. I'm quite impressed, though. I've gone through all this effort. I found an island. I go to the owner and I say, I'm going to offer you pennies on the dollar for how much you want for it. So he was rejected. A year later, though, the owner of the island needed money, went back to Branson and said, about that offer, can you improve it? And Branson said, actually, I've got a little bit more money. I can afford $180,000. And he said, done. So Branson managed to get what notionally was a $6 million island for $180,000.
I think there's a really important discussion here, which is quite often when we talk about success, we use hindsight, where we look at people's success as if it's a linear thing, and we forget the fact that luck plays a huge role in how successful people are, whether they make the right decisions, and more importantly, whether we judge that they've made the right decisions. But of course, luck is not something that is spontaneous. Luck is outside of your control. but it is created by the conditions that you set, as well as lots of other factors. So people talk about, people making their own luck. If you are inclined to be, I suppose in this case, necky enough, rude enough to offer a stupidly low amount of money, almost certain that it's not going to work, but planting the seed that then, a couple of years later, the same person comes back and says, I need the money, I'm pretty desperate. You are somebody who showed interest. Could you, up your offer? Then in the linear progression, you kind of get this, how lucky that. But I suspect if you look at Richard Branson, and I don't know if you've got other stories to tell, this is a pretty common trend. And most of the time it doesn't go anywhere. But he's a guy who's willing to, look a bit silly and offer stupid amounts of money for things that are worth a lot more.
I think if you don't ask, you don't get.
Yeah.
That's where he lives. And I bet he did it with a cheeky smile on his face. And I think the point you made about making your own luck, he's building his brand, he's creating his narrative, and he's becoming successful. You'll be pleased to know I'm not going to spend the next half an hour describing in detail every other business deal that he made, but let's talk about quickly some of the businesses. In the 80s and 90s, he purchased the gay bar Heaven in London. He made an unsuccessful bid for 3 ITV franchises. He was producer of a record called Bar Bar Black Sheep, and he was credited on the record as Jeff Mutton. Apparently, he decided very quickly he wasn't a very good record producer. In 1983, he created the Now That's What I Call Music brand. He formed Virgin Atlantic and Virgin Cargo, the airline, in 1984. Then in 1985, Virgin Holidays. The Virgin Rail Group then won the Intercity Cross Country and Intercity West Coast franchises, and he started Virgin Mobile. That is huge in terms of starting all those businesses and growing the brand at an incredible rate. So we've talked about Elon Musk and Tesla and PayPal and a couple of others. In terms of the number of businesses this man starts, and serious businesses, most of which are still going today, we'll talk about the ones that aren't, that's pretty impressive. An incredibly successful entrepreneur, starting from, remember, Budgie Grass and Christmas trees.
It is, and it's a staggeringly successful and diverse range of things. I wasn't aware that he started the Now That's What I Call Music brand, but that is perhaps the best well-known brand of what's the
collections, music collections.
Collections, yeah. And I would imagine if somebody back, I don't know when that was, but back in the 70s, had said, I want to create the most successful music collection brand. I'm going to release LPs, as they probably were then, of lots of different types of music from that year. It would still be an incredibly difficult thing to become the most successful. When you say that he's done that over this diverse range of things, there's something in there. What's the magic that makes him successful? Because it's not music, because he's also doing airlines and all of the other things that Virgin has done over the years. So what's the magic ingredient?
Well, let's come back to that. I'll throw one thing in now. Actually, I think his management style and his outlook on life, which we'll definitely come on to, but I suspect itchy feet is another one. I think this is a person who has an idea and then says, let's go do it. Impulsiveness almost. The man who says, my flight has been cancelled, so I'm going to charter an aeroplane. That's the kind of person that just wants to do new things and try new things. Hell, I've never done it before. Let's do it. Anyway, let's take a quick break. We're at the end of 1999. We're coming into the new millennium, and then we'll catch up and see what he does in the new millennium. Because if you think the 20th century was busy for him, we'll talk a little bit more about the 21st century. And then we'll spend a bit more time on his management style, because starting a business is all very well. successfully having that business continue when you have to imagine he doesn't spend as much time? That's a different thing. So let's take a quick break, come straight back, and we'll talk about after 1999, something about Luftballons in there.
Awesome. I look forward to it.
Welcome back. So it's 1999. I just like doing that, and I am going to sing Nana's Luftballons in a second. But it's 1999, and so far he's been a Christmas tree salesman, a record publisher, a music producer, a gay bar owner, an airline owner, a railway company owner. Oh, and by the way, I left out mobile phone company owner. You would think he had enough on his plate. In 2001, he announces Virgin Galactic. He wants to go to space. And Virgin Galactic, I think it's safe to say, was the first company who wanted to make space flights available to the public. And he offered tickets at $200,000. And he was going to use technology from another company called Spaceship One. But this is a man for whom he is not willing to rest on his laurels. He then does other things as well. And this, I think, starts to signal a slight shift as he slows down, because bearing in mind, he's now in his 50s. He's sort of starting to become a bit more mature. His next venture, perhaps his lesser known venture within the Virgin Group, because of course he has this very strong Virgin brand. Well, I'll ask you, I can't remember whether you actually mentioned this. Would you like to think, do you happen to know after Virgin Galactic what business he started?
The only thing I can think of that we haven't talked about is the Virgin Bank. So is it banking and credit cards?
It's not, and we'll come on to that because he did do that. It was actually Virgin Fuels. In 2006, Branson pledged to invest the profits of Virgin Atlantic and Virgin Trains into research for environmentally friendly fuels. Allegedly, and there is a little bit of a debate about this, his investment was estimated to be worth $3 billion. And after that, in 2023, so obviously quite a lot later, Virgin Atlantic flew the first commercial transatlantic flight using 100% sustainable aviation fuel, just to demonstrate to the world what is possible. That is really interesting. He's starting to be a little bit more philanthropic. He's starting to think about the future, and that's a huge investment, $3 billion.
Virgin Fuels is not something I'd heard of. I think I was aware of Virgin Atlantic's drive to use renewables and more sustainable fuels. Is Virgin Fuels still a going concern?
What a great question. I believe it is, but to be clear, it is between 2 and 7 times more expensive than non-sustainable fuel. So I think they're continuing to do that work. And the belief is that as they scale the business and they scale the production of these fuels, they can bring the cost down, but it is not commercially viable right now. We're not going to see airlines move to this. I think it's another thing about Richard Branson, which is, and we haven't used this word yet, is vision. He's got a vision for the future. He has, well, actually, I don't know in this case. Does he have a strategy for the future where he's investing for the long term? He has this guiding North Star, and that's going to get him down there. But just to go back to a point you made, and then we'll finish on the business side, other businesses that he has started, and it is important to say many of these have actually failed. So we'll talk about what he says about failure, but Virgin Hotels, Virgin Money, Virgin Brides, Virgin Cola, Virgin Cars, Virgin Publishing, Virgin Care, 3D Robotics, which was a drone company, and most recently he invested in Hyperloop One. Now, while many of those...
I'll just go back. Did you say Virgin Brides?
Yes, he sold wedding dresses.
That's a slightly more wholesome business than I was imagining for a minute.
Given everything that's going on with Epstein at the moment, I see where you were going with that. But no, this was a high street wedding dress company. But what's interesting, so he's talked about failures, and he wrote, I suppose the secret to bouncing back is not only to be unafraid of failures, but to use them as motivational and learning tools. Quote, there's nothing wrong with making mistakes as long as you don't make the same ones over and over again. There's all sorts of topics we have talked about. One of those is emotional safety. And this is a man who says it's okay to fail. We just don't want to make the same mistakes again and again. I can imagine, and we'll come back to this, this is the kind of person you would want to work for. And whenever you see photographs and video of him launching a business or people working in the business, there is a brand. Virgin is cool, it is young, it is optimistic, it's enthusiastic, he's created this brand. And I think this brand is very much a reflection of Richard Branson. I think it's an extension of him, and we see that time and time again. So just
I don't think I've ever seen a photo of Richard Branson when he's not grinning like a Cheshire cat.
Exactly. Yeah. By the way, and I think that annoys a lot of people, but I wonder, in fact, I don't
really like it.
I'm pretty sure, and I've heard lots of people who work for him are really passionate about him. This is a person they want to work for, and for good reasons. Just to finish off from the business, I know when we say influencers, there's this sort of level of, they've somehow reached this level of success. He has an estimated net worth of $2.8 billion. This is a really successful person. His business empire has grown, and don't get me wrong, while he came from a family where clearly there was a little bit of money, in a sense, he is a self-made man. He went away and did this by hook or by crook with an incredible business empire. Now let's shift to, and this is one that I do remember when I was younger because he was always on the news, his life as an adventurer. And I want to talk about this because, again, I think this is a combination of brand. I think this is a combination of Richard Branson, and I think it both reflects his businesses and reflects him. So he isn't just a risk taker in business. He has actually made several world record breaking attempts. So in 1985, there was a famous attempt where he attempted the fastest crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. And this was done in the Virgin Atlantic Challenger. And the boat capsized in British waters, and they had to be rescued by a Royal Navy helicopter. And of course, that was the footage on the news. Richard Branson, with a big grin on his face, being pulled out of the water by a Royal Navy helicopter. That's the first time we saw Richard Branson as the adventurer, but he didn't stop there. He then went back and did it again in 1986 in Virgin Atlantic Challenger 2, good name, 2, and he beat the record. So he's not a man who takes no for an answer. He wasn't successful the first time. He nearly died, went back and did it again.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a trend. So interestingly, the last influencer we did was Ike Eisenhower, and we finished by saying he was, an incredibly successful military leader and a very successful political leader, but he hadn't managed to translate those skills and that experience and intuition across to the non-public sector world. It sounds to me like Branson has more generic skills that are absolutely transferable. And those are things like an appetite for risk, a hunger and a passion to go after what he wants to achieve, tenacity, the ability to problem solve and find ways around challenges that are standing between him and those goals that he wants to get after. And I think, those are clearly things that you need as an entrepreneur, but they're also clearly things that you need as an adventurer.
And I think let's throw bravery in there. I mean, genuinely, this was a man that nearly died when his boat capsized, and he keeps going. Boats, well, we've done boats. Now let's go to balloons. So there was a period when he wanted to break balloon records. Later the same year, so this is 1986, he crossed the Atlantic in the Virgin Atlantic Flyer. In 91, he then crossed the Pacific, which broke the record with a top speed of 145 miles an hour. He then, between 95 and 98, tried to circumnavigate the globe, wasn't successful. Lots of other record attempts, so boats, balloons. And I love this one. So I knew about the boats and balloons. Turns out he's an experienced kite surfer. And I didn't know this. He has set 2 world records. The first was the oldest person to kite surf across the English Channel. And I can't remember what the other one was. I think that might have been a speed record or something. And there's a quote from him.
That's pretty bloody awesome, isn't it? Like if you were I was going to say a nobody, that's a really horrible thing to say. But if you're a average run-of-the-mill sort of person and you achieve being the first person to kite surf across the English Channel, or the oldest person, to kite surf across the English Channel, that is noteworthy in its own right. To be Richard Branson and also to do that, it's phenomenal.
His quote, "My interest in life comes from setting myself huge, apparently unachievable challenges and trying to rise above them. From the perspective of wanting to live life to the full, I felt that I had to attempt it." Now, I mean, fantastic. You can see he's very successful in this with failures along the way. But let's look at this a different way. Would you follow Richard Branson? Of course you would. Everyone would. That is the kind of person you want to follow. And if he turns up and says, "I've got this new business I want to start, will you come with me?" I would think that pretty much everyone would say, "I want to come with you." So how interesting where this confidence, this excitement, this wanting to break records, to set seemingly unachievable goals, there is an excellent example of creating this narrative and brand where people want to follow you.
And is there a clear example or is there a clear trend of setting these audacious goals in his business work as well? Does he turn to his teams and say, "This is what I want to achieve"? And they are, we did a whole episode on big, hairy, audacious goals. Is that something that translates from his personal objectives to his business objectives as well?
I don't know. I mean, as I've read about him, as I've looked at lots of articles, looked at some of the comments from him, that's highly possible. And we'll talk about his style in a second. But actually, I think for him, the goal is to start these businesses and then set them running. So I don't know. It would be really interesting. Maybe we need to see if we can get him on to talk about it. I could talk a lot about his philanthropy and his humanitarian activities. And actually, he's done an awful lot. There was a Branson School of Entrepreneurship, which was not for profit, a Global Science and Technology Prize. He's brought people together to talk about the environment. He took over Mia Farrow's hunger strike for 3 days in protest of Sudanese government's expulsion of aid groups from Darfur. Lots of things he has done there. But I want to move on for the last sort of 10, 15 minutes or so to talk about his leadership style. And what's really refreshing and interesting is many of the influencers and leaders we have talked about in this series, we almost have to tease out their style and how they think about these things. Richard Branson is very different. He's written a lot about it, including his book, The Virgin Way. And so I just want to go through a couple of the things that he has explicitly called out. Before I go into them, of course, they're blindingly obvious, but I love the fact that he's thinking about these things, articulating them, and clearly does them very well. The first thing he talks about is life is not a dress rehearsal. He talks about living in the present and grasping every opportunity. And if you doubt that, please rewind, go back to the beginning and listen to what we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes. This is a man who clearly grasps every opportunity and then finds the opportunities you haven't thought of and grasps those as well. The next one is much more subtle and much more interesting. And that is listening is the most important skill. And in fact, The Virgin Way is subtitled, I believe, How to Listen, Learn, Laugh and Lead. And while I admire the alliteration, I think there's a little bit of a tip in there, which is listening, learning, laughing, and leading. These are things that are really a focus for him. And the book explains that the best leaders are also great listeners. And it's listening to everyone involved in the business venture. And he's known on multiple occasions to specifically go to the most junior team members, as well as the investors, to go listen to them and hear what they think. And I think that's really, it's the kind of thing we've talked about, but he is known for that. He has been seen and has talked about that. I think that's really interesting. And he says most people make the mistake of listening too little and talking too much. He added, a better approach is say less, contribute more. Again, blindingly obvious, but interesting that as a leader, he is very clear he needs to listen because his team, and I'm sure we're going to talk about mission command, Auftrags tactique, all that kind of thing. Listening is a part of it.
Yeah, interestingly, today I was doing some reading around design thinking. And design thinking, on the face of it, is a really obvious thing because it's based around this idea of thinking around being creative and iterative to create user-focused approaches to solving complex problems. So it emphasizes things like empathy, experimentation, collaboration. And there are 5 phases to it. Empathize, so understanding people, defining and clearly articulating the problem, ideating to generate a wide range of options or creative ideas, prototyping, building testable versions of whatever it is you're trying to solve, so products or designs or processes, and then testing by getting feedback and refining and iterating. And it strikes me that that's exactly what Richard Branson is doing. It's listening to understand the gaps. He talks about being frustrated. That's identifying a real problem. Big, hairy, audacious goals and setting kind of challenges that need to be solved. Thinking about creative ways of solving those, and then testing. And one of the things that struck me about design thinking is it's really, really bloody obvious, but it's also very rarely implemented well because the concepts are simple. The application and leading organizations to behave like this is really, really difficult. So I think we're getting something of a sense of how he curates organizations to drive after and solve problems.
Well, let's build on that because the next point is always take notes. This is almost as if you'd read my notes. He talks about the fact people who take notes whilst listening are able to gather their thoughts and ask insightful questions when the speaker is finished. Firstly, it's more polite than interrupting someone, and it avoids disrupting the flow of their thought process. So you can tell this idea of I need to listen to people. I could keep interrupting them, but I need to take notes so I can process it later. Next one, which if you do know Richard Branson, and just as you said, you close your eyes and imagine that picture, he's got a big grin on his face. I think it is safe, even when he's being winched off a capsized ship, he looks like he's having fun. I think that's something special about him. And I think for other people, that's important. So his next point is be passionate and have fun. And he says it's really easy to feel overwhelmed and lose motivation. And while entrepreneurs have to take lots of serious decisions, it's really important to keep a sense of fun. And he said the entrepreneur's passion for a business or an idea should never take the back seat. So that we back to this, it's the flip side of frustration. There's a passion and excitement. And if we're not having fun, I wouldn't do it. But again, these are the conditions where people say, I want to follow you. I want to have a part of that. That looks like fun as well.
Yeah, I was about to say, one of the characteristics of the commando ethos is humor under adversity. And if you build on that, it's about making sure that you are seeing the positive sides of even really bad situations. But as a leader, it's about instilling not just confidence, but a sense of camaraderie
Well,
around the challenge that you face. And I think if you are constantly living life as if the challenge in front of you is really enjoyable, and it actually is, there's an authenticity here, I think, with Richard Branson, then that's infectious. And things that could be daunting or difficult or challenging become exciting and positively challenging.
yeah, he's a person who, if he came and said to me, "Would you come and work with me?" I think it would be very difficult for me to say no. His next one is an obvious one: take calculated risks. We've talked about this, but he goes on to say, by daring to be different, entrepreneurs can set their business apart, even from other more established brands within the same industry. And he learns. He constantly. You talked about design thinking. He constantly iterates. Virgin Cola failed, and he said, yeah, that was just stupid. The market had already decided it was Coca-Cola or it was Pepsi. There was no chance for me to be successful, even though I tried to be a bit different. So there's an element of really understanding difference. Last couple of these, I'll crack through them. But this next one, maybe I'll slow down a bit more. Put people first. He talks about good leaders creating a workplace culture that always puts people first. That,
Yeah.
again, none of this is surprising to us, but he actively talks about this. He actively cares about his staff. There was a friend of mine who has met him on a number of occasions, and he took time to meet them. He took time to speak to them. And I think in the case of my friend, he even remembered her name the second time he met her. It was all about the people in the organization as much as it was about the organization. And he talks about one size rarely fits all. So it's important to listen to the needs of each individual and find solutions that allow everyone to work at their best. I think this is another way of saying, and actually one of the other points later on I won't go into, is empower employees. There is your mission command. My
Yeah.
job is to paint a vision, to create an environment which is exciting and arguably safe. And I want you to be at your best because it's you that's going to make my business successful.
Yeah, I think the put people first is another example of one of those things that it's bloody obvious and we all talk about it and it's in all the management books and everybody says it, but it's incredibly difficult to do, especially when things are difficult and challenging. And the amount of organisations that I've either worked in, worked for, or helped advise where they've talked about putting people first, and then times, normally under significant financial pressure or stress, there's almost been a tacit acknowledgement that it's people first, but this time's different.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think it's one of those things that, it's easy to say, very difficult to do, but when it is done, people want to follow you.
Last two things that he says. The next one, hire your weaknesses, which I really like as well. And he says, rather than being held back by your own weaknesses, smart leaders hire people who have complementary skill sets. We're all good at something, and there's probably areas we're not so good at. What he finds is, I'm going to find people who are really good at the things I'm not good at and go and hire them. So again, common sense, but if you can do it, and let's be clear, this is a man who knows how to take these principles and enact them. That's part of his success. And then the
Yeah,
last,
I think that's what I was driving at when I, at the introduction, said about hiring people that are better than you. It's a better
yeah,
way of putting it, is hiring people that have strengths that you don't have and recognizing those strengths. Because the job of the leader is not necessarily to have the answers. It's to be able to know which person to turn to at which point to get the answers.
and the last one I've got, which is, think you wouldn't imagine this was the most important, but I suspect it's a key part of his success and the success of the businesses, and that is informal and accessible leadership. So, unlike most of the people we know or we've talked about, Branson's got this informal, down-to-earth style. He's always seen chatting to his employees, having fun with them, doing silly things with them, rather than saying, do you understand who I am? And his quote is, leaders should be visible, accessible, and approachable, and never stop learning. Just that sentence alone makes you say, I want to work for this guy. So that's really interesting, I think, that we get to see he is articulating how he thinks about leadership, which I think also to some degree, probably by coincidence or accident, we don't get as much from many of the other influencers we've talked about.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I think for me, Richard Branson is the epitome of the authentic leader. So whilst we have touched on a few areas where he is ruthless and a few areas where he has crossed moral rubicons that are questionable, and there's a lot of discussion to be had about not paying tax or lying to your business partner to get ahead. But in terms of creating and in terms of leading, he epitomizes this idea of authentic leadership, which is being honest about who you are and being really driven by building those personal relationships. Force of character is a really, really important thing. And I think it's sometimes misunderstood. And that I think the fact that Richard Branson is not a divisive figure. We talked about this with Dolly Parton, and we said one of Dolly Parton's key leadership strengths was that no matter if you're a hard South Republican or whether you're a upstate New York Democrat, people all love Dolly Parton. She's very rarely talked about negatively. I think Richard Branson's in a similar space. People very rarely talk about Richard Branson in a negative way.
Well, look, let's finish with the bit that I love doing with some of these, which is the quotes. As we've said before, one of the challenges is that, we interpret these influencers, these leaders, but given what we've talked about today, I think it's a really good way of sort of getting to know him a little better. So here's some of my favorite quotes from him. The first one is, there's no greater thing you can do with your life and your work than follow your passions in a way that serves the world and you. We've seen this throughout his story. You can see he loves this stuff. And I love the fact that he's put in serves the world. This next one is great. Talks about the sort of the teamwork, the mission command, and how he is not a micromanager, or at least he doesn't seem to be a micromanager. Quote, train people well enough so they can leave, treat them well enough so they don't want to. That's a good one. Quote, a company is people. Employees want to know, am I being listened to or am I a cog in the wheel? People really need to feel wanted. The next one is around fear. Quote, overcoming fear is the first step to success for entrepreneurs. The winners all exemplify that, and the hard work and commitment they've shown underlines what is needed to set up a business. Last couple. My general attitude to life is to enjoy every minute of the day. I never do anything with a feeling of, oh God, I've got to do this today. Next one. Quote, you don't learn to walk by following the rules. You learn by doing and falling over. I mean, these are all, you could have chapters of books around each of these. You shouldn't blindly accept a leader's advice. You've got to question leaders on occasion. There's a vulnerability there that says people can question him. Treat failure as a lesson on how not to approach achieving a goal, and then use that learning to improve our chances of success when you try again. Failure is only the end if you decide to stop. And the last one is, the way to become a great leader is to look for the best in people. Seldom criticize, always praise. And I love that as sort of the last quote, actually the last bit I'm going to do about him, which is, there is a man with positivity, optimism, we're going to win, we're going to have fun while doing it. That is pretty compelling as a leader, as an influencer.
Well, thank you, Chris. That was really, really good. I really enjoyed thinking about Richard Branson because he's somebody that I I'm very familiar with and aware of, but haven't really stopped to think about, particularly from the perspective of leadership. Because as you said at the beginning of this podcast, he sort of dropped out of, the media attention and the media spotlight. But I've really enjoyed thinking about it, and it's got me thinking about design thinking. It's got me thinking about authentic leadership. It's got me thinking about the challenges of balancing risk against reward and managing that in a really positive way. So thank you.
No, pleasure. And I mean, I really enjoyed it because it was someone where I started to ask, why is it we don't hear about him much and why don't we talk about much? So it's a remarkable story. He's a remarkable leader. He's personally and professionally brave and committed. He looks forward and he looks beyond the tactical. There's the where am I going next? Where am I getting to? He seems to me to be the British Elon Musk, but without all the craziness and without sort of the bits that we don't like about Elon Musk. He's tenacious, resilient, adaptable. He's a fun-loving party person who just doesn't say no. In fact, saying yes is an important part of what he does. Amazing charisma,
Yeah.
amazing brand, loves a challenge, and maybe the bit that I like the most because I'm a romantic, doesn't seem to be a bastard. Too many of our influencers are highly successful, and we kind of talk about the downside and we sort of say, well, we're not all perfect. He doesn't seem to be a bastard. And so my sort of the thing that struck me throughout all of this is I actually don't know why we don't talk about him more. And maybe, and you touched on this earlier, maybe this is all about the fact that he isn't crazy. We latch on to the crazy people. We latch on to the people who say terrible things. And
Yeah.
maybe that's a failing in us, that we think about the people who make the noise and make the news rather than going back and finding the people that in that weird sense, while he's very public and very loud, but in a sense is quieter. So I don't know. That was just interesting to
Mm.
me. Someone who clearly an influencer, but maybe someone we haven't talked about, maybe as much as we should. Still stuff to learn.
Yeah, I think we're all guilty of chasing the sensationalism and focusing on what riles us up rather than what inspires us. So yeah, I think you're right, and I think I'm going to go and read Richard Branson's book now.
The Virgin Way, available at all good bookshops, and he gets all the money and not us. Well, look, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Gareth. I'm glad you enjoyed that. It's always fun when we come up with these people and sort of talk more about them and go into a bit more detail. If you have enjoyed this, we have lots of other influencers that we've done, from great military leaders to great country and Western singers of various kinds, through to leadership and management gurus from the late 1800s. So please do go back. Every month we do an influencer, and I think myself and Gareth particularly enjoy these ones, especially when we surprise each other. If you have listened to them and you like it, please share it with other people. Tell them that they should go listen to this Battling with Business podcast. We'd love to sort of continue to grow our listenership and people who can engage and come back to us. And talking of that, we are available on Battling with Biz on X and Blue Sky. And we are also available on battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. We would love to hear your suggestions about who we should talk about as an influencer next. We're also really keen, even though we don't talk about it as much, to hear about what you disagree with. In fact, one of the things we're talking about is we should do an episode where we get listeners' questions and we can talk about those as well. I think that covers everything, Gareth. Subscribe if you haven't already done so. I think I've ticked all the boxes. I think that's it for today on Battling with Business. Thank you very much for joining us.
I'm about to go and jump on a long haul flight home. So thank you very much. And the next time I see you, hopefully we'll be back in the UK.
Excellent. Thank you. And we'll speak to you next time on Battling with Business.
Cheerio.